This is going to be part 2 of my sky watching series of videos. I recommend you watch the last part of the introduction video where I discuss the camera placement, and I'll leave a link to that in the description. I could see the north-facing camera was not properly set up on the very first night. You can see that the weather hood reflected the infrared light back to the camera and it appeared washed out. So you can see a little bit over here, and so this is the infrared light being reflected off of the house and off of the trees. I couldn't even see the stars at that point. There should be one right around here somewhere and another one right around here. I started placing the cameras and basically tweaking the position of everything. After I had adjusted the weather hood, by the second night, I could see it was much better, and I was delighted to make out some stars. So you can see this one right here, and you can barely see the North Star over here. But whenever I looked at it and zoomed in, I could see that the pixel sensor noise was causing some really interesting artifacts in the JPEG image and kind of bleeding in with the stars. So the stars were a little bit harder to see. So I just loaded that image in GIMP, and if I zoom in, you can see that it just appears like a bit of a blob around what appears to be a whole bunch of really interesting kind of like hash-like patterns. So my next effort was to reduce the effect of the background noise as much as I could, and the best way to do that is to stack the images. So I looked online for an image stacker and I couldn't find anything particularly useful or suitable, and I quickly gave up on that and I decided to write my own. So being a software developer, I just created a simple image stacker project, and that's basically it in a nutshell. So you provide an output file and 2 or more input files, and it loads all of the input files, creates a new one, and then it just goes zipping through each pixel and averages out all of the input pixels. And it does that separately for each color, the R, the G, and the B, and then writes the average pixel out on the output. And so you can see that before too long, so you can see here I was still trying to place the images. You can see that that was the first couple of nights, and I was mainly looking at the corner of the house. Then I tried it over here for the third night and realized that I couldn't really see much pass through the trees, and so a couple more nights I ended up putting it in this position, which is just about near the final position. So it's pretty much stayed in this general direction ever since. I got distracted there a little bit with the camera position, but when I looked at the pixel noise, I just loaded it in GIMP so that I could increase the brightness and contrast. And when you do that, when I do that, you can see if I zoom right in, you can see the grain of the image much more clearly. And this is partially an artifact of the way JPEG compresses images and the fact that the sensor has noise that kind of like looks like snow on an old analog TV. So it ended up creating these funny looking hash like patterns, and on the 26th it looked pretty bad. And then what I did was, after I had loaded it through my image stacker, it looked a lot better. And here you can't really see the stars too well, but I'll show you on the 31st in a second. If I increase the contrast after having stacked it, it now looks less of a kind of hash pattern. It looks more like random noise. And if I could take enough pictures fast enough and stack enough of them up together, I'd probably end up making it even better than that. So here's the 31st, and you can see that the images are a lot more clear. This is with the contrast turned way up. And if I look at the original picture, the image, you can still barely see the stars. But in an animation, uh, the stars really stand out at this point. So by the end of the first week, I had addressed the noise of the camera, and I was reasonably satisfied both with the placement of the camera and with its ability to see the stars. Because I had placed the cameras in the backyard, it meant that the house was blocking the street light and the cameras didn't have to contend with those. But I did see that the infrared lights, which unfortunately I could not disable in the settings, still lit up the corner of the house and the trees, and it appeared to change the auto exposure enough to make the stars harder to see in the images. So at this point, it was pretty much the end of August, and both the north and the south facing cameras were working pretty much as I had expected, and I was hoping that they would. And I was kind of hoping that the start of September would be the official launch of my experiments, but I was still looking at the south facing camera and I still wasn't quite happy with that. And I did spend a little bit more time playing around with that. And in particular, it was dealing with the location of the sun during the two solstices, and that I might not be able to capture all of the sun or much or any of the sun during those 2 days. So I ended up adjusting the camera, and I described that already in the introduction video. So that was near the start of that was September 9th. Luckily, somewhere between the 21st and the 22nd, these cameras were so cheap that water had managed to seep in and kill the infrared transmitter board. And that let me see the stars more clearly. And unfortunately, I don't have an image on the 21st, 22nd loaded. So if I take a look at the south-facing camera for a second, you can still see that it has the infrared transmitter working even now a year later. And when I had bought this camera, again, did I say that did I mention that these cameras are cheap? The gearing mechanism that they have to set the focus and zoom starts slipping, and then the adjustment nut doesn't even make contact anymore. And the first one that I had bought started off okay, but slipped whenever I was trying to do the final tweak adjustment, and it got stuck out of focus, just out of focus, that it was really kind of annoying. So when I got the replacement, that one was badly out of focus right from the beginning, and the adjustment nut didn't even work. So I didn't want to bother going back to replace that one, and I even couldn't because they only had three in stock, and I bought the first two, and the third that they had in stock was a replacement of one of the busted ones. So at that point, they didn't even have any. And on August 26th, when I had set these up and I was trying to play around with these, I was wondering whether or not I should scrub the project before it even started. So I didn't even have a day of worth of collecting the images. And I just decided to take that one apart and manually adjust it and kind of fix it and get everything lined up and then set it up. So the south facing camera I got just about properly in focus. This should be Altair, I believe. And it's just barely out of focus, which is probably not a bad thing considering this one here sees the sun. And if it's slightly out of focus, then the sun won't quite be so in focus and might not necessarily blow out any of the CCD sensors. So I was kind of debating if I should pull it apart and disconnect the infrared transmitter board so that hopefully without it lighting up the trees that hopefully it would end up auto exposuring enough to be able to see a few more of the stars. And I decided against doing that in the end. The other thing that I was thinking about was whether or not I should put a solar filter on it. And it obviously doesn't come with one that deploys automatically if it gets too bright. And that would mean that I'd have to go out and manually put one on for the daytime and take it off for the stars every night. And just going back and forth like this every day would not be very practical, not to mention it would be outside, so it would be exposed to all of the elements. So I decided to not bother with the solar filter, and I would have to estimate the exact position of the sun by kind of marking the center of the solar flare. And I'll describe that in another video at some point eventually, probably the next one. And so at this point here, everything was pretty much aligned and set up. And I had a process that was recording the images reasonably well. At this point, everything was pretty much automated. I've got some scripts that run on my computer that go and get the image every minute. I've got it automatically set up so that between 5 p.m., which is after sunset in winter, and before 7 a.m., which is sunrise the next day in winter. So between those two periods, I could have changed it back for the summer. I could have adjusted it so that it would be more like 7, 8 o'clock at night in the summertime. But I just left it at 5 p.m. and 7 a.m. Between those two periods, it ends up taking the 8 images and stacking them together. But between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m., it just takes a single image because there's enough light. By about this time last year, September 26th of 2019, I had placed the cameras in a position I was reasonably satisfied with, and I had implemented an image stacker so that I could bring out as much detail at night as possible while washing out all of the noise as much as possible, and that I was kind of more or less satisfied with the placement of the cameras. I started to work on one project around this time, but I'm going to save that for another video, so stay tuned for that. If you like this video, don't forget to comment, thumbs up, do the usual whatever, you know what to do, and I'll see you again in another video soon enough. Bye for now.